Thanks for staying with News Night tonight. President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed the national minimum wage bill into law. It's expected to benefit about 6 million workers that currently earn below 3,700 rand a month, and it comes into effect on the 1st of January 2019. For reaction on this, I'm joined by Charissa Raja, a labour lawyer from Fasken Matinu. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Charissa. Firstly, your initial impression of the final law now that has been signed by the president. What's your take? Is it good news?
I think I'm two-minded. On the one hand, of course, I'm cynical. It's very close to election time. On the other hand, I am optimistic because he didn't just sign the amendment, national minimum wage bill into law. He also signed the other three bills, and I think cumulatively, it can only be a sign of hope for people who live below the breadline, in my opinion. Moreover, it creates benefits for people across our country in relation to the labour laws amendment bill in terms of parental leave, adoption leave, surrogacy leave. It also creates certainty around strikes in terms of the ballot, the secret ballot, in terms of the picketing rules, in terms of the interest arbitration that the Labour Relations Amendment Bill brings to the table. So
if I hear you correctly, you're not just looking at it from the framework of what it means for how much workers take away at the end of the day, but the broader than rights or access that it has opened up for workers in terms of the general conditions of employment that they face.
Absolutely. If you think about the Labour Relations Amendment Bill and the amendments there, so often strikes go on for weeks at a time. Now what happens is there's a secret ballot provision, but also they provide picketing rules. There's also provision for the parties to go into an interest arbitration where they come back to the table and talk about exactly what's the issue. And a conciliating commissioner is able then to help the parties potentially, maybe, hopefully, reach consensus or resolve their dispute without protracted strike action.
So it could potentially change the way in which we see strikes taking place in the country.
Yeah.
And of course, you joined us a day after we had the Free Market Foundation on Newsnight. And last night, the group's Leon Lowe was vehement in saying that he believes that the minimum wage bill is in fact anti-investment and that it is anti-business. What do you say to people who have that view?
I mean, I would find it hard to agree with that. And my own opinion is that the bill, National Minimum Wage Bill, as it currently sits, and you've said yourself it takes effect next year, will create better conditions for between 4 to 6 million people in this country. That, coupled with the Constitutional Court's judgment on a sign in terms of labour broking, we can only really see good things for people who are fighting for better conditions. And this talks not to established corporates who are keen to comply, but to the bucky brigades, the people who can't negotiate for better, the true vulnerable workers that the Constitutional Court identified in the labour broking judgment not too long ago.
Yeah. Let's then also talk about those employers who simply cannot afford what the minimum wage prescribes. How much room is there for them to maneuver, and what kind of exemptions have been accommodated in this law?
So there is a process for exemption. An exemption will be permitted for a maximum of 1 year, after which if they still can't afford it, they must reapply. In the application they make to the commission that's established under the National Minimum Wage Bill, now the Act, what is required is they need to explain why they can't afford it, and in addition to that, what they propose that they can actually pay to these people who would otherwise be eligible to receive the national minimum wage set. In addition to that, the national minimum wage comes, piggybacking off that is the Basic Conditions of Employment Amendment Bill, which allows labour inspectors the rights to enforce, to investigate, to ensure compliance, and it confers on the CCMA jurisdiction to determine disputes arising out of the national minimum wage. So in the event an employer decides to say, well, actually, I can't afford it, they're going to have to advance bona fide reasons why they can't afford it.
So it simply won't be good enough to say, I can't afford it. But, of course, the people that we're talking about here that are affected are, people like your domestic workers who, at the end of the day, are employed by individuals. Very often they don't have set contracts. And even with the downturn of the economy, we heard from the Domestic Workers Association recently talking about how people were quickly losing their jobs. So in cases like that, are you saying that there's a real cause for a domestic worker to dispute why they're being paid less, or even why their contract is potentially being terminated?
So on that, there's 2 points. One is, under the national minimum wage provisions, you can't contract to less than what you would otherwise be entitled to unless it's more favorable. The second point is, national minimum wage in relation to domestic workers is set at 15 Rand per hour. And it will be reviewed again in 12 months' time. So it would be difficult for an employer, a household, to pay less than 15 Rand an hour if they are challenged by their domestic worker on this provision. They're obliged to comply. And a dispute of this nature could go to the Department of Labor, for instance, where a worker could say, I don't earn the minimum wage prescribed. The concern I have is I do hope that this kind of provisions are canvassed publicly so it becomes commonplace, so people are aware of their rights, because that's a bigger issue in all of this as well.
You know, it's so interesting, because as this law comes into effect in January, it means that there's a lot more than anybody who employs anyone, whether it's just generally in the household, which we know are the lowest paying skills, but also within the workplace, that people have to be better capacitated in order to ensure that they're complying with the law. So what advice do you have for our viewers tonight who are thinking, hey, I don't want to be caught in the wrong here by virtue of just being ignorant. So what should I do in this moment to better equip myself?
Well, I think citizens of South Africa are required to become au fait with the amendments insofar as it may impact them. When you employ someone, whether it be a gardener, whether it be whether you procure the services of a contractor, whether you are an employer in a corporate, the one thing I would urge South Africans to do is to employ and to behave responsibly. There's always exemption processes. There's always a means to limit your exposure, to reduce your risk. But it doesn't mean that because it's there, one should use them. We should behave responsibly in how we exercise our rights to exemption, if in fact we do have those rights.
And are there going to be penalties for those who don't subscribe to this minimum wage?
Yeah, they are. The one, again, a caution for me would be, do we have enough labor inspectors in the country to go out and monitor and enforce? As it currently stands, in terms of what's currently our law, we already have a shortage of labor inspectors going out and checking that employers are behaving responsibly. But I will say that they are...
And this is just in the open place, kind of corporate environments or manufacturing companies, or where you have perhaps employment on a bigger scale, let alone where it's just maybe 10 people employed.
I mean, the nice thing about manufacturing, for instance, you have vocal unions, you have employers' organizations. Employers are keen to employ responsibly, to have conversations with unions. More and more now you see that unions and employers are working together to say it's in our interest to never stop working. So how do we reach each other middle ground? What's our compromised position? So parties walk away saying, I didn't win, but I also didn't lose. I walked away knowing what I shook hands on I can actually live with. And I think if we can get there in all aspects of this, I think we would be doing very well. And maybe we close our wage gap.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's good news for workers that have been marginalized for so long in our society. I think it also is going to require intent from those that are now responsible for drawing up those contracts and adhering to the minimum wage and ensuring that they are on the right side of the law, as it were. So, Sharissa Raja, a labor lawyer from Thasken Martinu, thank you so much for your time tonight, Sharissa.
Thank you.